Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome to Nightlight, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. We love it when you come and share your time with us, and we make every effort to make sure that the material we give you is interesting, fascinating, enlightening, and maybe a little bit tantalizing here and there so that it stretches you into doing some research on your own. I want to thank first Ken Quiethawk for the amazing intro. Check out, Google him, and check out his Native Storytellers. He and his wife have preserved that tradition for a very long time, and it's amazing and interesting to see how other cultures preserve and share their history and their stories and their cosmology. Tonight Mark has a lovely guest that we've had on before, and they're going to be talking about a new book that is out, and I'm very excited because the topic is interesting to me because we've had Katherine on before, so she's going to be helping to enlighten us all as well. So, Mark, the show is all yours.
Okay. We have done 2 of the 4 shows this week. We're just getting started on the 3rd. I think the listeners are getting a wide variety of historical topics this week. Your Sunday and Monday shows were excellent.
Yeah, they were fun. They were more than fun. They were. I learned a lot, and both of them were very, very different, spectrums, but both of them were fascinating for me, and I had a great time. So, and I intend. Right. I'm sure I'm going to have a great time tonight too.
Okay. Yeah. I have to go over one thing, and we'll start delving into our topic. So sometimes we need to stop and acknowledge those who helped us to get to where we are. And a couple weeks ago, Buddy Cage passed away. Buddy was the pedal steel virtuoso for the New Riders of the Purple Sage. And we met a few times, and when he called me about an interview I'd arranged for him, he gave me a 4-year college communications degree in about over a 20-minute phone call. And he discussed being prepared, organized, and the importance of pre-production. And those are the work ethics I brought to Nightlight, and I think we're going fine. So I just wanted to do a little tribute to Buddy and send my condolences to Elvira and the New Riders family. We have a return guest who will be introducing us to a reissued book and discussing an important conference. Katherine Chiljan is the author of Shakespeare Suppressed, and we will be discussing the importance of Shakespeare Identified. It's thoroughly researched book. So much of the Shakespeare Authorship Controversy can be traced back to J. Thomas Looney's book. It's really a fascinating book. I highly recommend. And I really enjoy these themes that he brought up that we really haven't covered on these other shows with Katherine and Alex McNeil and Ramon Jimenez. But there's Looney was brought up. The author of the plays attributed to Shakespeare was a medievalist instead of a man of the Renaissance, and De Vere suddenly stopped writing and Shakespeare emerges. That gives us more evidence that there were at least two people involved in this conspiracy. I don't know what historical mystery. There are hidden clues in the echo poem. If you like the topic of this Shakespeare authorship controversy, this is a fantastic book. So, hi, Katherine. How are you?
Hi, I'm well. I'm delighted to be on again. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So, we're going to be covering Shakespeare Identified. The book is being is reissued, the right word, as part of the celebration of the 100th anniversary of its publication.
Yes, the book came out in 1920, so yes, it's the 100th anniversary, and it was published on March 4th. And so people, like-minded people like me and you, are going to meet in Washington, D.C. to celebrate at the in Washington, D.C. at the Press Club on that date. So it's very important to Oxfordians. This is the founding of our theory, if you still want to call it a theory. A schoolmaster named J. Thomas Looney, actually it's pronounced Looney, but people say Looney as well. He taught Shakespeare to his students over and over and over the plays. He was very well versed in them. And he was looking at the biography, and it just didn't quite square with the impression that the works gave him of who the real author was, what he was like. And that started his book.
Okay, so this is the book that identified, gave us a name with the real author of the plays that are, world masterpieces.
Yes. The controversy of who Shakespeare really was pretty much erupted in the mid-19th century. And Sir Francis Bacon was the first person promoted primarily because of his outstanding educational background, and that sort of person is of the same caliber that Shakespeare was. So, and the Baconians put out wonderful books against the Stratford man, that it could not have been the man born in Stratford-on-Avon, a real person who was born with the name William Shakespeare. But because there's no lifetime evidence that he had any education or that he was a writer, it depressed his case. I mean, where is this man? He's like a mystery man. We don't have any evidence of schooling. We don't have anything in his handwriting. We don't have payments to him as an actor or a playwright. When he died, there was no notice of his death. So all these things, like, look a little odd, all these zeros. And so the Baconians pretty much advertised this and wrote great books about it. But I think maybe when Looney, I'm sure he looked at some of these works. I'm sure he couldn't quite square Francis Bacon as the author based on his impression of the writer of the plays. And he methodically kind of went about it, and he made a list of what the great author had as far as characteristics. Like, he had to have been somebody who was a recognized genius, I'm just reading off what he wrote. He was apparently eccentric and mysterious, unconventional. He was enthusiastic with the drama, had a superior classical education, and then he further goes on to say he had to have been an aristocrat, and he makes this long list. And the way he was going to find his man, he was going to look at an anthology of 16th century verse, all different sorts of writers, and he was specifically looking at the writers that wrote in a certain rhyme scheme, like 6-line stanzas. I don't know the exact term for it, but anyway, in this certain anthology that he picked up, he looked through it all, and there were only 2 authors who wrote that way. One of them was anonymous, and the other one was the Earl of Oxford. And he didn't know anything about the Earl of Oxford, so he went to the Dictionary of National Biography, and he looked into, his history, and one after the next of these characteristics just kind of perfectly suited the Earl of Oxford, so and the great author. So that was his great discovery, and I would say it really was the greatest discovery in Shakespeare scholarship. But unfortunately, no one knows this, and they don't even know who made this discovery. So that's the point of our trying to get the word out with this conference in the 100th anniversary.
Okay, and Katherine, you just mentioned that Looney was trying to find his man. This Shakespeare Identified book really is an early version of profiling. I don't know if it would be considered forensic profiling, but what Looney does to find his man is basically that, just looking for the little bit of information that was available, like the Burleigh papers on the Earl of Oxford. There was some information on him but there wasn't anything on Shakespeare. So in the wake of Freud and all of his psychological theories developing at the turn of the 20th century, Shakespeare Identified is really a very intense profiling book.
Yes, it was very methodical, and every page he kind of wants to address doubts that people, he always tries to give both points of view, and he does it in a very succinct manner, and you feel very confident as you move through the book with him that he is really building his case and is being successful at it. And you can also see his personal enthusiasm when he makes a certain parallel that he thinks is exciting. And it must have been a great joy for him to work on this book.
Yeah, and there are examples that from this really where he discussed the book being his theory, but he does make some very valid points. And just looking at achievements of other authors, he does discuss that you have Dante and Cervantes, all these people that wrote these great masterpieces were much older in life. The masterpieces come from maturity. We just don't see that happening with, if we just stick with Shakespeare as being the author, and he's only 26 years old. Milton was 55 when he completed Paradise Lost. Scott was 43 when he was starting on the Waverley novels. Looney's time frame of attributing this work to Shakespeare, the man from Stratford, just doesn't add up based on the maturity level to produce these masterpieces.
Yes, and there's no, you don't see any, they call it juvenilia. You don't see any youthful works supposedly written by the Stratford man. All you have, like for example, in 1593 was the first printed, the name as an author, William Shakespeare, which was attached to the poem Venus and Adonis, which is a very sophisticated poem. I think it's 1,000 lines or something like that. They call it rhyme royal. And yet, in the opening dedication, the great author mentions that this is the first heir of my invention. And your first reading of that would be, oh, this is the first thing he ever wrote. But it's impossible because it's too sophisticated. So anti-Stratfordians, like me, Stratfordians, we see that as he's referring to the poem, his first usage of his pen name, William Shakespeare. on a work. That is the first error of his invention. It's his invented name. So that's the bottom of the theory, is that the name William Shakespeare was someone's pen name. And the man from Stratford was a real person, and he was born with that name, William Shakespeare. Actually pronounced Shakespeare if you look at the documents of the period, how it was spelled phonetically. So, outside, when you have all these absences that I mentioned, like, no education as far as we know, no contacts, important contacts as we know, nothing in his handwriting, etc. You add up all those zeros, and the concept of a pen name makes sense. So we shouldn't be looking for information of a William Shakespeare. We should be looking for the man using the pen name William Shakespeare. So it's a kind of you have to have a new point of view when you're looking at Shakespeare. There were actually two William Shakespeares, one born with that name and another one using a pen name.
Okay, yeah, I thought that was an interesting point, and just mentioned it in the opening rant. But it was interesting that there's the Edward de Vere's, like mature writings suddenly stop, and all of a sudden Shakespeare's writings are being published. It's just it just seems like there's like this merging of two people. That really put the hooks in me about from this book. It was very captivating to see that something isn't adding up. The pen name, now that you brought it up, does start to make sense. And also in the book there's a lot of information about Edward de Vere, fraternizing with other members of the nobility, and one of the people that with whom he had a rivalry was Sir Philip Sidney, and there was this documented. This is the first time I've heard that story. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened in that rivalry?
Yeah, in 1579, the Sir Philip Sidney, who was a courtier poet like the Earl of Oxford, he was playing tennis, and the Earl of Oxford came in, and he either wanted to join them or he wanted, them maybe to move or something. And keep in mind that tennis is an aristocratic sport that the great authors seem to know a great deal about. Anyway, so Sir Philip Sidney didn't move, and the Earl of Oxford, I think, just called him a puppy. And I eventually, at some point, Sidney wanted to challenge him to a duel, but the Queen would not allow it. But I mean, you could say that they were rivals in a way in literature, and they had kind of two different ways of writing, two different schools of writing. And also, Sir Philip Sidney was at one point almost engaged to the woman who Oxford would eventually marry. So there was a little bit of dynamic going on. And also Sir Philip Sidney was the supposed heir to the Earl of Leicester, because the Earl of Leicester, he did not have any legitimate male heirs, and Sidney was his nephew. So there was kind of a little rivalry in that sense too. So yeah, that's just one incident that Looney brings out. But he also gets very excited when he learned about the character Bertram in All's Well That Ends Well, which is a Shakespeare comedy. And Bertram is the main character, and he's a nobleman from an aristocratic family. And his mother sort of adopts a young lady to live in her house, in her household with him. And anyway, the husband dies. Bertram's father dies, and Bertram hasn't quite reached 21, and it was a feudal custom back then that if you lose your father and you have an underage son, the king he comes into the king's household. The king appoints somebody to be the guardian. And, well, those you have parallels right there. The Earl of Oxford experienced the same thing. He was 12 years old when his father, the 16th Earl, passed away. So it meant that he became a ward of the court, just like Bertram. And so Oxford moved into the home of his guardian, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, and Lord Burleigh had a daughter who was about 5 years younger than Oxford. In the play, the daughter falls in love with Bertram, but Bertram does not, have the same feelings. And the similar thing happened with the Earl of Oxford. Young Anne Cecil, fell in love with the Earl of Oxford, but he was not interested. But Burleigh had the power to arrange his marriage, just like the king in Bertram's case would allow the marriage. So he set it up that he was going to marry his daughter. And there was one wedding date, and Oxford did not go to it. So, he was really adamant. But eventually he came around and did marry her. But Bertram, although he went through the marriage ceremony, he would not live in the same house with her, and he did not sleep with her. And he was adamant about this, and he just, I think he went traveling, and, he had mistresses of his own. And an interesting part of the play, which really got Looney excited, was that the young lady who loved him arranged it so that when Bertram was sleeping with one of his mistresses, that they would do a switch at night, in the thick of night. And so the lady that loves Bertram ended up sleeping with him, and he got her pregnant. And anyway, it's later revealed at the end of the play. But the Earl of Oxford also had an incident, and this is recorded in history books, of a bed trick in the same way. So, you can't make these things up, These are autobiographical touches that the great author has inserted in the works, and it just so happens the Earl of Oxford has these same things. And the same with Hamlet, who on his way back to Denmark, his ship was attacked by pirates, and he was stripped bare. Well, the same thing happened with the Earl of Oxford. After he took his grand tour of Europe, he came back crossing the Channel, and pirates attacked his ship and took all of his possessions. So these are just a few parallels. There's so many others.
Okay, so all of that information is clearly documented. This, we can get into this sonnets maybe a little bit, but the example from All's Well That Ends Well and Hamlet, Sir Philip Sidney and the puppy incident at the tennis court, all of that sounds like it shows that the Earl of Oxford is mingling with pretty much the nobility at all the different castles around England. It makes it more easily understandable that the real author was writing about his peer group, not as someone like Shakespeare wanting to, write outside of his class.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at most of the protagonists of the plays are high nobility or kings and queens and princesses and duchesses and dukes, and that was the Earl of Oxford's world. His family was one of the oldest in England. The Earldom of Oxford was like, I think, several hundred years old, maybe 500 years old, when he inherited, became the 17th Earl. Most of the other nobility were like the first Baron or the second Earl, or they were very low on the scale. He really came from a very prestigious, famous family, and that gets us into the reason why he would use a pen name or write anonymously. It's because writing plays and poem and being involved in literature and actors, that was considered, unrespectable and, just not something that someone of that rank should be doing. It was considered frivolous. You should be, if you were a nobleman, you should be helping the Queen in some way as a minister or a general or a judge or something along those lines. But when you look at historical record, which was only recently discovered, was that the Earl of Oxford, it was discovered in the 20th century, the Earl of Oxford got £1,000 per year grant from the Royal Treasury, and there was no accounting needed to be made. So, the way we look at it is that he was helping produce these plays, and for not only the Queen's entertainment, but also for educating the masses about England's history. So many of the plays they're called history plays because they're all about, great events in England's past. And when the grant was issued, which is 1586, England was facing a threat from Spain, the Spanish Armada. And actually 2 years later, the Armada did make an attempt, to attack England, but they were not successful. But it makes one think that plays like Henry V, which were very patriotic, so many rousing speeches of the prince speaking to the troops, that this may have been a tool, you could call it propaganda, or just something of national pride to have them, join together and try their best to defeat the enemy.
James Warren edited the centenary edition of Shakespeare Identified. What was his role in this book? What did he contribute to it?
Yeah, what he did was, the book was printed in 1920, and so the way it was laid out, the pages, the print on the pages were small, and there were a lot of spaces between the words and things like that. He made it more readable to today's reader. The format. He changed the format, but he also, what he did was he tried to track down exactly the sources that Looney used to write the book, so we could refer to them now. And he found a few of the citations were not exact, so it was nice that he, cleared up authors and dates and things like that. So it was a very useful thing that he did. I'm sure he's still finding things. And I don't know. I think he may have. No, there was a pretty good index. Anyway, so he just makes it a little more accessible to today's reader, and we're all grateful that he did that. He's also done extensive research on articles came out after the book reviews, and things like people's reactions, and his defending himself in letters to the editor, things like that. So he's compiled quite a large a collection of Looney's writings outside of the book. So we're all very grateful to him.
Okay, we've only had a chance to touch on some of the information that's presented in this book. I'd highly recommend it. But is there anything that you disagree with Looney about, or the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship disagrees with his conclusion, or is it pretty that he made some pretty strong arguments that really can't be challenged.
Yeah, I'm sorry. What is the question? Or
just for the 100 years that this book has been out, is there anything you or the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship disagree with Looney about?
We're all different, and I don't think the fellowship. The fellowship doesn't have a list of what they think is right and wrong about Looney. I think that we basically have come together because we all agree that his conclusion is correct, that the 17th Earl of Oxford was the true Shakespeare. I think on my end, I think maybe he didn't quite explain the Stratford man's role. And there are some of his conclusions about certain poetry works that may or may have, been written by Oxford as well. So Looney published a book of Oxford's poems, and I think he included some that were not that I would think were actually Shakespeare or Shakespearean. I think that would be the only point of disagreement on my end. But that's open to question,
Okay, you've edited a book on Edward de Vere's letters and poems. What did you glean from that experience? Did you see patterns or repetition of the use of certain words or phrases that we see in the plays or sonnets?
On my end, what I found was the tone and the gentility is similar as what you would find in a Shakespeare play of nobility speaking. I see that very much. But I have not done an analysis of the words, but actually somebody has. Last name is Fowler, and he goes line by line with the Earl of Oxford's letters. We have about 70 or so letters of his. They're mostly business letters. And he finds parallels with lines in some of the Shakespeare plays. So that's a very useful book. William Plumer Fowler is his name.
Okay, and when if people want to learn more about this book, you said that there is a conference on March 4th at the prestigious National Press Club. Maybe Barbara and I will be speaking there next year. But,
yeah. Yeah, well, we're going to have speakers, about 3 or 4 speakers. It's in the afternoon from, I believe, 1 till 4, and it's fairly close to the Folger Shakespeare Library, and people, they could head on in there too. And I believe they usually have a display of Shakespeare's First Folio in the main lobby. So I'm sure it's always a good thing to go there. Yeah.
So people can tour, see the lecture, then walk a few blocks away to the Folger Shakespeare Library.
Yeah, that would be a nice day for Shakespeare lovers. But of course, the Folger Shakespeare Library, I mean, they don't really comment about the authorship question, unfortunately. But that's the same for most Shakespeare organizations, attached to academics, and that's the unfortunate thing. If you spent a great deal of your life reading and teaching Shakespeare, and you don't want to know about controversy that surrounds him, you wouldn't want to investigate it on your own, I find that sad. Like I said, Looney's book really was the greatest discovery in Shakespeare scholarship. But Looney is unknown, and we're still trying to get the Earl of Oxford out to the general public so they can know him, the people who love Shakespeare. When they discover the real man, their whole experience of Shakespeare is just going to be filled with more multi-dimensions and biographical references that just make reading the plays even more wonderful. And that's the whole point.
In the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website does have more and more people discussing about why they became Oxfordians. Yeah, are more people picking up a copy of Shakespeare Identified, or hopefully they're hearing some of these shows? But it seems like more people are also realizing that things just have not added up with the traditional biography of the man from Stratford.
Yes, more and more people are becoming interested and convinced, and they include, people like Sir Derek Jacobi, who's a Shakespearean actor of renown, and Mark Rylance, another. He's a Sir Mark Rylance. He's another Shakespeare actor. He's not 100% for Oxford, but he's definitely not. He's not convinced that the Stratford man was the great author. Those are just two. But if you go to another great site besides the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, is doubtaboutwill.org, and you can read a petition that we call the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt, and saying that it just can't be the Stratford man, and you can sign it and be one of the signatories. And there are, I believe, 4,400 at the moment, and most of the signatories are people with higher degrees. Some of them are English too, English degrees, but we're trying to establish credibility, but the main people that we want to convince are the English professors and English departments. And unfortunately, they're just not open to discussion, or they have been in a very limited way. And unfortunately, they treat our theory as, not convincing, or I mean that's a very nice term for it. Or they call people who question it amateurs or snobs. They just cast aspersions. I would just say, hey, prove your man, the Stratford man, prove that he was the great author with evidence during his lifetime, not the posthumous evidence. That really doesn't count. Let's get the lifetime evidence. And if you look at the lifetime evidence for the Earl of Oxford, it's overwhelming. Everything about Shakespeare can be accounted for with the Earl of Oxford's life. I mean, his superlative education, his knowledge of Europe, his knowledge of the law. You had to go to special law society to get the law to the extent that Shakespeare knew it. In fact, his knowledge of the law is probably what got Baconians interested. And also Mark Twain. He wrote an authorship book too against the Stratford man in 1909. It's called Is Shakespeare Dead? And he was convinced that it wasn't the Stratford man because of Shakespeare's knowledge of law. And there's just absolutely no record of William Shakespeare attending these law societies, and these records exist. The records exist also for Oxford and Cambridge universities, which were the main universities where you could learn things like ancient Greek and medicine and other languages which Shakespeare knew. And there's no William Shakespeare on those rolls either. But the Earl of Oxford went to Oxford. He went to Cambridge. Actually, he was 8 years old when he went to Cambridge. So he was a child prodigy. And he was also a major figure in the Elizabethan court, and yet very little was really written about him historically. He was kind of left out of history, which is also a little suspicious. Was that intentional? And it could be because the works perhaps reveal something a little too hot. And certainly there's a lampooning of the Queen's top minister in Hamlet. That's accepted by historians. And that was Lord Burleigh. And Lord Burleigh was Oxford's guardian at first when he was in his teens, and then he became his son-in-law. So he knew him very well to sort of lampoon him. And it's, it just speaks for itself at every turn that the true author was the Earl of Oxford.
Yeah, all the information that you brought up tonight and what can be found in Shakespeare Identified just can't be attributed to just coincidence. It just seems like been attributing these remarkable literary feats to the wrong person for over 400 years. We get in one of the sonnets, you get what was it, the phrase like besmirched youth, or it's like his the author was embarrassed about his past, and I can't believe that a nobleman would be so feel so completely worthless all these years later after like the deer poaching incident at Charlotte Park. I just don't see it just doesn't add up. But once you start looking at evidence that the real author was a nobleman, all the pieces start coming together. It's like a puzzle, and there's just so many new topics that we haven't discussed, and even with Ramon and Alex, we haven't gotten to them, but there really is so many really fabulous observations and captivating summaries in this book that if people are interested in the subject, this is kind of like the granddaddy of all the Shakespeare Authorship Controversy books.
Yes, and he gets into the psychology kind of as well, and I think that's what attracted Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was a big Oxfordian. So, and I think it also helped him explain some of his theories. He used some Shakespeare plays with this added dimension of the Earl of Oxford. But if psychologically, if somebody, lover of Shakespeare, really wants to get the author, to know the great author, you've got to read the sonnets. The sonnets are really his deep outpouring of, his inner soul and beyond the expression of love for two people, very important people in his life. And we can just throw out another interesting parallel. There's someone that he addresses, a beautiful dark-haired lady that he addresses, and he's very almost obsessed by. And the same thing was so for the Earl of Oxford. He, when he was estranged from his wife, he took a mistress, and she was a dark-haired beauty, one of the queen's attendants, and they had a child together. And as a result of that, when the queen got wind of it, both she and the Earl of Oxford were thrown in prison for about 3 months. So, and everywhere you turn, you're going to find a perfect parallel with the Earl of Oxford.
Mm-hmm.
And there's one great line in Sonnet 76, every word doth almost tell my name. And we say every is e-veer, every word, a name play, doth almost tell my name, and it certainly does.
Okay. That sounds like we're back to this is not a random coincidence, happenstance type thing that occurs in Sonnet 76 with, where he's basically, Edward de Vere's basically including his last name in that line of the poem or the sonnet. That just doesn't randomly happen.
Yeah, he also refers to his lameness, and the Earl of Oxford was injured in a street fight with the family members of this mistress that he had, the Dark Lady. And the great author speaks of his own lameness in Sonnet 37. So, I mean, it just everywhere you look, it's his story. It just fits like a glove. And it's just something that can't be ignored, because for lovers of Shakespeare, their experience is just going to be so much more enriched. And that's the reason why I'm doing this. And beyond the injustice that was done to him, being divorced from his incredible works that he knew were great. It's tragic, and it's time to right the record.
Mm-hmm.
And Looney even said it himself. He said that this demands a difficult revolution in mental attitude.
It's powerful.
Difficult for people who subscribe to the Stratford man as the great author. They've got to look at the evidence and have a revolution in mental attitude. I agree. It's not easy, but once you do it, it's going to be so rewarding, in my opinion.
Okay, so what are some things you have coming up, or the fellowship? There's the March 4th conference at the National Press Club. Do you have anything going on, or anything else going on with the fellowship?
Yeah, well, there will be the conference. We have an annual conference, and it's going to be in Ashland this year, in Oregon. And, that's where every year there's many Shakespeare plays performed in Ashland. It's a mecca for Shakespeareans, so you can learn about, the details on the Fellowship website. And I will probably be speaking as well. I'm also working on a new book, but I'm unfortunately a slow writer. So.
What, do you know what your topic is going to be at the Ashland conference?
Not yet. I'm still working on it.
Okay, well, you still have 9 months or so.
Yeah, it's toward the end of the year. I believe it's October 1st this year. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, all right. You wanted to just do an hour. Do you have any final conclusions you want to interject, or Barbara step in and wrap things up?
Well, just learn about Shakespeare Identified by J. Thomas Looney, and that's the reason for our discussion today. 100 years has passed, and let's start to right the wrongs. That's my message.
Okay, and it really is an excellent book. I'm glad you brought that to my attention. And once I got it, I was like, oh, wow, this is fantastic. I've just been enthralled by it for about the month I've been reading it.
Yes, and there's been, subsequent, a few years later, there was a wonderful biography of the Earl of Oxford by B.M. Ward, and in Maloney's book was reissued, I believe, in the 40s, and then it was issued again by Oxfordians, the Millers. They put out an annotated edition as well, and so it's gotten a lot of attention over the decades among our society, and but he didn't explain everything, and when Charlton Ogburn he wrote a wonderful book in 1984 called The Mysterious William Shakespeare, and he really crystallized the case for both against the Stratford man and for the Earl of Oxford in a beautifully written book. And what my book, which I first published in 2011 and reprinted in 2016, was to just try and put all the loose ends together in one unified theory as to what really happened. And the last two chapters of my book, I explain, what was behind it and how the Stratford man got the authorship. And it was really after his death that it was given to him, and by the first folio, the opening pages. So anyway, I get into more detail that Looney really didn't get into. His was really just to identify the real author, and that's the importance for us.
Okay. So we can end there, and unless you have a last minute idea that you want to bring up, we could have Barbara step in and wrap up the show.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Please.
Okay. Mark, you have the longest goodbyes and tie-ups ever. Thank you, everybody, for being with us tonight. I hope you learned something. I know I sure did. Look for us again tomorrow night at 9 o'clock with Mary Joyce, and then, of course, next Monday and Tuesday as well. Hope you are having a good evening. Thank you for sharing your time with us. We really appreciate it. Check out the YouTube channel, and if you like what you hear, please make sure you subscribe. Good night now.